Item 9, I'll put it on the table for discussion. So thank you, team. Item 9, I'll put it on the table, and it's been seconded by Councillor Casey, and it's in regards to the youth centres and our investigation. So I'll welcome up both our ladies, and Liz, if you could introduce both yourselves, and then we'll head into the report.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Liz Civil tōku ingoa. I'm the Manager of Culture and Diversity Policy in the Community and Social Policy Department, and with me I have Cleo Matthews, who's a policy analyst in my team, who's done all the hard work on this review. So I've got a very short presentation, just 3 slides about this report. So it is to provide the governing body with an overview of how Council currently supports youth centres and non-council youth services. So youth centres and youth services. So it was, this review was undertaken at the request of the governing body in response to agreeing a one-off contribution to the Hibiscus Coast Youth Centre back in 2018-19. So that was the catalyst for this review to be undertaken, to provide Council with the wider context of how do you support youth centres across the region. So for the purposes of this review, youth centres are defined as facilities that are dedicated to youth use, with a depth of infrastructure and service offering in place to support young people, and facilities catering primarily to young people, but where they may also support the wider community. So that's what's within scope. It's not everything Council does for the young people. We have all sorts of activities and services that we provide for young people across the region through a whole range of different programs and community facilities. So they're not specifically within scope of this review. So I'll just move to the next slide. She says. Oops, there we go. Am I doing something wrong, Maya? There we go. So I'm just going to go through the key findings from this review. So while Council has a child and youth strategy, I Am Auckland, it has no specific policy currently that guides provision and funding for youth facilities specifically. And so decision making is generally, for youth facilities, has been responsive, with current distribution reflecting legacy decisions and more recent investment decisions being made in response to very localised needs assessments on a case-by-case basis. So this review identified 145 youth facilities across Auckland. Of these, only 10 are currently within Council's service levels. The bulk of the rest are community leases to third parties, and of those community leases, over 50% are to Scouts and Girl Guides. So it just gives you a little bit of a context about the kinds of things we've got. A range of funding exists for externally run youth activities and services, and the level of investment we're making in those are generally proportionate to our youth population. So around 12 to 13% of grant funding is going into youth activities and services, and our youth population's around 14% currently. So we didn't identify strong evidence of gap for provision within Council's remit. That's not to say there aren't a lot of youth needs across our region, but within Council's sphere of influence and control. And generally what we found that where there were fewer facilities, there's often more funding to external youth providers. And of course, the youth facilities are supplemented, as I said before, by Council's own network of community facilities, which provide space and activities for young people. That's our libraries, community centres, arts centres, leisure facilities, swimming pools. So there's all sorts of provision that actually provides activities and support for young people beyond a tightly defined youth centre definition. I'm not sure why this is... Maya, can you flick this through, because this doesn't seem to be working, so just flick through to that next slide. Thank you. So we set out options within this report, and the benefits and trade-offs of those are covered in the report. But in view of the findings, and coupled with the current financial constraints that the Council finds itself in, we're recommending option 1, which is the status quo, which allows decision-making to continue to be flexible to respond to community needs without specific provision guidelines or policy for youth facilities. Because we saw considerable risk for Council at going down a policy provision approach that could have significant financial ramifications. And look, Mara, if you could flick the next slide for me, please. Just wanted to do a kind of postscript around, note if you like, around COVID-19. So there are implications coming out of that for young people. You know, the advice and recommendations of this report were based on the full range of Council-supported activities and services available pre-COVID, and we acknowledge this situation may have changed or potentially will change as a result of the pandemic and the emergency budget decisions you have to make. So the wider impacts of COVID-19 on young people are still emerging. but they are likely to be significant for some young people, particularly in areas like employment and health and wellbeing. So we undertake to continue to review and monitor the impacts of COVID-19 on Auckland's young people, including the impacts of any changes or reduction in services that council might need to make, and also what central government's doing in terms of either changing its services, increasing investment, and seeing what the impact is of that is on young people. So we'll report back to you on those as part of future I Am Auckland implementation reports, and we have the next one of those reports coming to this committee in August. Originally, we were planning to report back on implementation of I Am Auckland alongside this report in April, but because of COVID, that was deferred. It wasn't seen as essential for this committee, and we're coming back to you in August. So we'll update you on the impacts of COVID and young people at that time. So that's it, Alf. Thank you.
Yep, thank you for that, Liz. And look, I just want to sort of canvass and get comments around why option 2 and 3, the reasons behind why they weren't put up in regards to this one here. I understand why option 1 was. Yep. But it'll be good for at least the committee here to end up getting some feedback and information around why the other two or either one of the option 2 or 3 put up, please.
So we did want to provide the committee with options to consider in terms of the pathway forward. And option 3 obviously is that where you would take a regional guidelines and provision approach, a bit like we do with other community facilities. Our thinking was that really that is going to raise significant expectations about provision across the region that perhaps is not affordable right now. And actually we have a network of facilities already where we could be doing more to support young people if that is a priority in any given area. So working within our existing infrastructure, we know how expensive maintaining networks of facilities are. So we didn't feel that was a practical option right now, even though it might be a more equitable option in the long term if finances and fiscal constraints weren't such a big consideration. We also had some fundamental questions about whether, in fact, youth facilities are the best way or the only way to support good youth outcomes. In fact, there's lots of evidence that suggests that more targeted programs that don't necessarily rely on a building or a specific dedicated facility are just as effective. And we see what's happening in South Auckland with the TSI, for example, and the kind of effective programming they're doing that aren't necessarily facility-based. So that's kind of why option 3 wasn't seen as one we would recommend. Option 2, this was really, and again, I think that because the findings we didn't think there was a huge evidence of need. That's a fundamental reason why we went with status quo. But I guess we're realising that youth have a whole range of needs, and if there was appetite to put more investment into this sector to support more youth wellbeing outcomes, then how could we do that equitably across the region for all boards to have more investment to put into young people? And we were proposing an option around that if there was appetite for that. And I guess what we're saying, in light of COVID-19, that's probably not something that you can consider, but obviously that is still an option on the table that this committee could choose to recommend through the annual plan or long-term plan processes.
Now, look, thank you for that, because I know everybody, not only around this table and on Skype, has read the agenda item. So I've got a question from Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your report. I have to say I'm always a bit concerned when the response to a gap, a need, is we need to do some more policy work, policy discussion on this. I actually don't want more policy. I just want things to be fixed. But I worry actually the discussion about, well, there's always an option for us to be able to achieve more within our existing network. The question that I'm beginning to wonder as we implement the changes in response to the emergency budget is actually, do we even have the ability to do that? What is the practical implication for the organisation as ABS is affected to even achieve that existing baseline? And or are we actually already seeing an erosion at that level too? So in effect, we're going to see a diminishing product offering to a vulnerable constituency of Aucklanders. So can you comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that was the point I was making at the post-COVID 19 postscript that, we know that this current pandemic and the implications of that for Auckland Council are such that it may result in the reduction of service levels in our existing facilities, and that could have a big impact on young people. So we don't know the full ins and outs of that yet, but we certainly are undertaking to monitor that situation, and we'll report back to this committee on what we're seeing. So I think you've raised a really valid point, Councillor Newman. I don't have the answer what the impact will be, but I suspect there will be implications for a range of population groups across Auckland, young people included.
Well, there's a follow-up for me, because I actually am quite sympathetic to the situation affecting the young people in the northern parts of the region, but I actually don't necessarily have confidence that we're going to even be able to hold the status quo. In fact, I'm very concerned as to that status quo seems to be built on a foundation of clay under this budget. So what is your line of sight to the change in the service levels under the status quo option?
And look, I may need to call on my operational colleagues to talk to some of the ramifications of that, who are probably more over the detail as to where those cuts in operational activity is going to happen across community facilities. So I'm not sure, Claudia, if you're able to comment on that.
I mean, if it's not available today, can I at least get a pro forma memo sent to me with a discussion to follow up? Because I really worry that the status quo, and the local boards will feel this first because they're right at the coalface. But there's some operational changes here, which I don't know what those changes look like, but they appear to be scary. And if you don't have information today, I'd like to get that information in its best and most detailed form as soon as possible, because I am not sure as to what the status quo will be, but I'm nervous about it.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Certainly the COVID situation is creating a lot of challenges around planning and service provision. At this stage, we don't know the specific implications for this type of service. What we're very mindful of, though, in all of our planning and budgeting is that we support those communities who are most vulnerable and that we don't undermine important initiatives there. As we work through the budget consultation process, which is about to start with local boards on the 22nd of June, we will also get some clarity there regarding some of the facility impacts and how that informs our budget planning. So we're hoping that throughout this consultation process, we'll get a lot more clarity from elected members in our communities about the areas that we need to focus on, and we will pull in that information to help inform our planning. So once we know that information, we can then feed back to this committee to provide further insights.
Yeah, there's quite a few, but I mean, we can always come back and let's see what happens from there. But if you, Councillor Newman, if you want to ask it, let's get it up there, so then at least the team know.
The idea that we'll learn more from elected members to inform this process, I'm not sure about that. I suspect there'll be a lot of local board members who will be feeling like the situation about the effects of an adjustment to ABS will be provided to them for information, and I'm really not sure as to what their ability to inform you will actually be, because I think that it feels to me like they'll be presented with a fait accompli because of the COVID budget. And so I'm not quite sure what additional information you will learn from a consultation with local boards. To me, I think there are some operational impacts that must be known about that will be discussed with local boards, but it won't be led by local boards. It feels to me like it will be an officer-led discussion about how we manage the impacts of a budget adjustment. So thank you for the work that you're going to do, but I'm very interested to know what the officer's expectations are in terms of the consequences of an adjustment to the budget and how it will affect these service offerings.
So thank you for the question, councillor. We do not, unfortunately, at this stage, know the answer to the implications of that. However, we are keeping those principles in mind, and I would like to reassure you of that regarding the vulnerable communities.
Matua Moken, look, can I, and I forgot to say this, but look, can we just keep it to questions, and then if we got comments, people can then make their comments after the questions. Thanks.
Kia ora, thank you for your report. I'm just looking at the your Māori Impact report. Obviously, all the numbers and the figures, they all tell us what we already know, but I don't really see anything in the options on what, it doesn't actually say how we're going to look after rangatahi Māori, and yet all of your numbers and all the numerals and everything way up that we are right out of kilter, the disparities there. So, but I don't see in any of the options where it actually points out what we're going to do for Māori rangatahi, and we're at the top of the list.
Through you, Mr Chair. So this was looking specifically at youth centre provision and how that pans out across the region. And it is not the full picture of council's investment in young people, including Māori rangatahi. So I Am Auckland has that fuller picture. So there's all sorts of things that council does. There's a goal specifically around how we're supporting Māori young people within that strategy. And there are a range of things that council does towards that end. So this was a specific scope. So, and yes, in terms of community leases, for example, only 1% of those were Māori organisations. It's probably fair to say that Marae are probably where, in terms of facilities for young people, are probably a greater centre and hub for those than leased buildings on council land or and such like. So yes, there is. This is not the full picture of council's investment in Māori young people. So I think the report that's coming in August will have a bigger view of that. There's things like the investment that's being made through the Southern Initiative in with young people, Māori and Pacifica young people, around trades training and pathways out of unemployment and the like. I think there's going to be also, we'll be keeping a watching brief on what the government's doing in that space and the opportunity to leverage the investment that the government is making, particularly in pathways for people who may be facing unemployment, and young people has been key in that area. A lot greater emphasis, for example, on trades training and apprenticeships that may be coming through. So I think there is other things that council is doing in that space that this report may not reflect.
Kia ora for that. Thank you very much. I'll just finish on the last comment. I mean, 51% on the leases, as you know, for Girl Guides and Scouts is fantastic, but 1% for Māori, maybe marae in consideration for other things, might actually change that disparity.
Yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Casey, question.
No, mine's a comment, Alfie.
Okay. I'll put yours first. Councillor Coombe, question.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Kia ora. The Waitemata Local Board went through quite a painful process to get a youth needs assessment drafted a few years ago, and I was just curious to know why there's no mention of that in the report, or whether it's because it wasn't really considered to be relevant to this discussion. And I thought of it, I was wondering about that as I read the report, but then also, Liz, with what you were saying about how there's a view that it's not so much bricks and mortar facilities that we need, but other services and support for youth. And that's pretty much what that report landed on, and that a big part of the problem was a lack of information, of even knowing where there were venues and places that youth could go to and get support. So it felt like a real gap that wasn't kind of acknowledged, that assessment had been done and that it had some really good information in it.
Through you, Mr Chair. And I guess the scope of this was very clearly on what support and investment is council making in youth centres. So we didn't necessarily uncover every bit of work that local boards were doing or commissioning around that. That's not to say that work is not completely valid and part of the bigger picture that we refer to here about how council is supporting youth in a whole range of ways, including local boards. A lot of local boards see youth as a priority and have mentions in their plans about that. So I suppose that's the short answer, is it wasn't really within scope of this particular review, but that broader I Am Auckland progress report looks at a whole range of things about what we're doing that are probably informed by the likes of the work that you've done or that Waitemata Local Board did in their area. So other boards have done similar things. Our youth empowerment team are doing all sorts of programs with young people across the region. They're part of our community empowerment unit, and they specifically focus on young people. Again, they're not mentioned in here specifically. Does that answer? Yeah. Yeah.
Chair, supplementary? To that? Just supplementary to this specific. So just out of interest, would that not be very helpful as supplementary information for councillors to have that, so that we would have access to fabulous reports like that, so that that would then enable us to further understand the position and views and opinions? So just if you would please answer that. Kia ora, thank you.
Certainly, and we can look at that breadth of provision. And it's just a shame that the report that we had planned to do around the IM Auckland implementation progress wasn't supplementary to this report. That was the original intention, so that councillors could see that broader landscape of investment that we're making. So, when we come back in August, we'll have that bigger picture for you.
Yeah, that's where I was going to mention as well, and the recommendation E.
Yeah, the timing's just unfortunate around that. So
Around
that was the
Auckland.
original intent.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Walker, question.
Right. I've got a few questions, Mr Chair, and they are questions. I'd just like to reserve my right to speak and note that there may well be an amendment. So some questions. So on page 45, point 45, page 25, there's a chart and it lists a whole bundle of council facilities, and under funding, it gives funding, but is it not the case that in addition to that funding, where it's a council-owned building and council is funding the building costs and the operating costs, that you would also have expenses like building expenses, maintenance, insurance, water, sewage and the like, and that those expenses could amount to as much as $100,000 or more, especially if you take into account depreciation for some of these facilities and maybe most of them. Would that be the case?
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor Walker. Good question, and you're absolutely right. These costs are exclusive of those maintenance and building costs that are part of any council-owned facility, and they don't tend to be disaggregated. They tend to be held by our Community Facilities Department in an aggregated way and spent as they are required across the network of council-owned facilities. So yes, this is the pure operating costs related to delivering a service and the program, rather than those building-related costs like insurance, depreciation.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
So
thanks,
you're
Liz.
absolutely right for clarifying that.
My supplementary question that goes specifically to that, so in the consideration of this item going forward, could we have at least some ballpark numbers? And they might be based on asset coding or accounts coding or the like. I'd be pretty sure we could supply some of that information. Would that be helpful, Liz?
Through the chair, we can certainly see if we can get that information from our community facilities colleagues. Whether they have that broken down like that by facility, I would need to inquire and see whether the forensics of the accounts allow us to do that.
And would it be fair to say that if we want to make a comparison between the funding for the Hibiscus Coast Youth Centre that does meet all of those expenses, that sort of information would help to inform a fair comparison?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's great. The other question I've got just goes to page 28, and there's a big regional map on that shows the council-owned youth centres and shows other youth centres. Is it correct that the only dedicated youth centre between Devonport, Takapuna, and then up to the vicinity of Warkworth and across to the vicinity of Helensville and Kumeu is the Hibiscus Coast Youth Centre? Would that be a fair assessment of that?
Yes, there may well be other council facilities, though, that provide youth activities and services. So this is just dedicated facilities there.
And would it be also fair to say that within that huge area,
And last question, Wayne.
that facilities for youth are pretty poor. You know, there aren't too many theatre complexes and a whole range of things within that vast area that youth might attend. And it's just an observation, and it reflects on the issue that goes to the Waitemata youth assessment.
So look, that's an observation. So look, there's no need to cover that. And as I previously said, when the Hibiscus Coast Chair was here, he has an avenue in regards to the youth centre, and he will take up that avenue in regards to any funding through the Finance and Performance Committee, as well as
And I had one last very short question.
And
Mr.
consulting on the emergency budget. Councillor Walker, as a result of respect to the others that wished, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 still to come. So look, if there's time...
Are we time pressed today, Mr. Chair?
We are, in regards to the agenda. So look, if there's time, I will come back to you if there's time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Because I want to end up giving, out of respect to the councillors around here, time to ask their questions as well. So I'm going to move to Councillor Cooper.
Probably is a little bit of a question. It's just, I mean, this is our council-owned buildings where we actually give a contract for them to run the building and the programs within those. So, I mean, I'll just say my say and thing at the one. And so the question is, I guess, the increase, there haven't been a lot of increases because I was part of signing the contract for Zeal back in before amalgamation, and it was 120. So, and this adds on other grants. So I guess for me is, do we look at those kind of over time, how much costs go up, or is it just that I mean, this year we're constrained anyway, so that's my comment. I get that, I support option 1. So is that something, because we can't be ad hoc the way we've been going on, it just doesn't work. We can't keep adding this and adding that. So is this really for us an attempt to, let's find a policy, how we do it, but we can't implement it this year? That's what we're really saying, isn't it here? We can't implement a policy as much as we'd want to change numbers this year. We've got to wait. Is that kind of what you're getting at here? I mean, we're going to stick with what we've got because we can't afford to do anything else, but developing a policy will actually guide us in future years when we've got more options in terms of money.
So Liz,
through the chair,
response to that.
I mean, this report was actually originally written pre-COVID, so it wasn't directly related to those COVID implications. That we were generally saying, actually, we don't think going down a youth provision policy approach is the appropriate way to go for council, because again, for a number of reasons, as I said, the financial implications and whether in fact bricks and mortar are the right response for supporting youth wellbeing outcomes. We're not convinced that is necessarily the case, and we can do more with our existing facilities anyway. So it was a multiple of reasons why we were suggesting let's not go down a policy approach to this. So it wasn't just about the financial constraints, it was a range of things.
So I guess just to that then, my question is, then how do we deal with I guess we'll have ongoing provisions if we still have contracts with people. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that in an equitable way rather than just per head of population, or, how do we deal with that?
Through the chair, there's a number of things happening. My understanding is with ABS asset-based...
We not use... Sorry, local board acronyms, we don't know what they are, okay? Sorry, thank you, it annoys me.
Asset-based service funded assets. My understanding is they are CPI adjusted, so they do go up each year based on a CPI adjustment formula. And there is work through the government's framework review to look at how equitably those are being funded. And again, my operational colleagues may need to comment on that part as to how the envelope for those is looked at and more equitably provided across the region. So there is work underway in that space. I'm not sure if Lisa or anybody else would like to comment on that more specifically.
It will be an issue. There's no class 4 money, nothing available.
So we'll just... Lisa, then we can move on.
Kia ora koutou. As
councillors will be aware, we are doing a piece of work that's come out of the governance framework review on funding and service levels. So that gets reported through to the Joint Political Working Group, which has both councillors and local board members on it. We're at the stage now of having looked at current service levels, moving into a phase of looking at equitable service levels, and that will be reported through the political working group into council committees and with local boards over the next couple of months.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Lisa. Councillor Dalton on Skype, and then it's Councillor Bartley and Councillor Watson, if we have time. Councillor Walker again with a very quick question.
Thank you,
Councillor Dalton.
Chair. It seems to be getting more complex the more that we talk about it. And so there's two pieces here. There's one about the facility, so the bricks and mortar, and then you made a comment regarding the Southern Initiative and how things can happen outside of bricks and mortar. My question would be, what effect do you think that the Southern Initiative are having on youth in the southern area? Because I think that answer might be around who's determining what the impacts on youth are. Is it youth, or is it the Southern Initiative, or is it what we think are good outcomes for youth or outcomes for youth?
Through the chair, it's difficult for me to comment specifically around that and answer that question. Need Gail Surgeon from the Southern Initiative to respond around specifically how they're measuring their outcomes they're having. What we've observed through the reviews and things that they've done is that they seem to be having great traction with young people in the southern area, specifically targeted young people, particularly Māori and Pacifica young people, through their things like the trades training program that they're running alongside government. So I have limited ability to comment specifically to that question. So perhaps we could take that away and get a response from Gail Surgeon, who manages that team.
Thank you, and I have comments for later. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor, and I'll put you down for. Did you say you had comments, Councillor Dalton?
Yes, please.
Okay, I've put you down after Councillor Casey and Councillor Walker. Thank you, Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you, Liz and Cleo, for your report. I wanted to ask about the options that are being put up and the option that you've recommended being option 1. My concern is that, if there's no process or application process to apply for funding for things, then you won't apply. So how do we address, transparency for those that are not in the loop to know how to get this kind of funding this way, when there is no actual process for them to be made aware of and, find out about? And would that be addressed through any other options that are on here? And perhaps we need to look into the future to address that particular issue, rather than go with this option, considering the COVID situation that we're in. So I'm interested in your thoughts, please.
In terms of ability for community organisations or youth organisations to receive support through council, there are some transparent processes through our grant processes, either at the local board level or through our regional grants programs, although a lot of the local stuff that happens obviously doesn't qualify for that. So those processes are transparent. Arguably, annual plan and long-term plan processes are also transparent processes, and it's one of the things we highlight in this report, that one of the trade-offs of not having a provision approach is that we get ongoing ad hoc requests through annual plan and long-term plan processes. So, and that potentially disserves some communities who are not familiar with those processes. So we've acknowledged that in the report as one of the trade-offs of not having a provision approach. So this is, I guess, really what we're asking you to do, councillors, is to consider those options and the trade-offs and what things you're prepared to trade against. And for all the reasons we've already set out, we've proposed that we stay with the status quo. It does allow us to respond on a case-by-case as we need to. And local boards have been proactive where they've seen real need in their communities to advocate and to undertake needs assessment work about what's needed in their communities. So we've seen the more recent examples like Te Oro and Kaipātaki's Marlborough Park Hall, and what's happened in Panmure more recently, where the local boards have identified specific requirements for young people in their communities and have made things happen. So, for example, Panmure Community Hall, they have taken a hall that was probably underutilised and have invested local LDI funding into that for youth services and activities. So those routes are still possible through this status quo. Does that answer your question? Sorry. It's no easy answer. That you're grappling with the trade-offs.
Councillor Walker, can you put your microphone off because it's, thank you.
Yeah, the crux of my concern was around accessibility. It's not an accessible process because if there is no process, you don't know about it. And I'm trying to figure out which option will prevent kind of backdoor funding going out, and those communities that don't know how to access into the council funding pools.
Yeah, and Liz, you've said, and it's in the report around the funding that's open to those that are council-owned and those that are not. This is why, again, I go back to the chair of the High-Piscan Coast and told him around going through to the emergency budget process around consultation in regards to what he wanted. So he's happy to do that and go through to finance and performance around the fund for them. And I think that would apply to others as well. But it'll be good to sort of have a look as to how we can get the information out around accessibility or having access to the fundings that are available within council. To our local boards.
Through Chair, the option 2 does present an opportunity to put more investment into the system, but we know the trade-off of that. Is that affordable right now? That's
the position that we all obviously have to face in regards to getting extra money. Thank you. Councillor Watson.
My question goes to the table on page 25, and it really goes to this notion in the recommendations how youth are generally well provided for by council across the region. And I look at that table there and see a lot of very good youth organisations that do a lot of great work, like the one out in Roskell we went over to many years ago, and the other ones too, a couple of whom I've called in on. Someone mentioned the phrase going forward, what's going to happen going forward, and I look at the figures there, 2018-19, but if we look forward, and notwithstanding Councillor Newman's very valid point about the impact of any budgets on a vulnerable constituency, is it correct to say to a greater or lesser extent, even though there might be cuts of some magnitude, that if we take the first 6 there, they will be going through successive years, largely with the sums that are identified there in one shape or another. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Through the Chair, I guess that would be a reasonable assumption, particularly where any of our contracted partners, their funding, I think, is more protected given they've got service agreements that they set that out and money in the long-term plan. But again, that broader implications of what's required to do, the council's required to do in order to balance its budget, I'm not sure of all of the impacts of that yet, and I guess that will come to the councillors in due course as part of the emergency budget.
Yeah. Okay. So we that goes to everything, but those figures that are there indicates a commitment going forward, and as you've said, additional to that is the capital works and maintenance that go along with those facilities too. Okay. So let's cut to it. What's the outlier in amongst all that goes to 0, 0, 0, 0 in those ones? So the region as a whole is getting looked after, but in amongst those ones identified there, one particular organisation goes this year to 0 and 0 and 0 and 0. So I bring that up in the context of the fundamental premise of the whole report that youth centres are well catered for and no gaps in provision, etc., etc. There is an outlier there, isn't there?
Through the chair, yes, certainly Hibiscus Coast Youth Centre, its funding is not secured through the long-term plan currently.
Okay, yeah. And I'll reserve my right to speak to that when this item comes up in terms of the regional context. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, because I just note before I go to Councillor Walker with this very short question is that the table that was referred to on 25 is headed dedicated council-owned and operated youth centres or facilities that covered those. And then we've got in our second one is council-owned facilities with youth focus. Yeah, just wanted to point that out. And then the other examples, council-owned facilities and youth focus, which was on the page. So, Councillor Walker, I'm going to allow you to ask this quick question because then I'm going to go to comments and there's 4 people already waiting. So, Councillor Walker.
A very quick question, and it could just be answered by a yes. So is it fair to say that when you've got an asset, and it could be a youth centre run by a charitable trust, but that asset is not a council asset, that effectively as far as asset-based funding, operational funding, it completely falls through the cracks? Is that the case? Or it can?
I don't think I can answer that question, Councillor, because we do have examples of facilities that are owned by other third parties on our land that are partner facilities, so the likes of Q Theatre and, so yeah, I can't say that categorically.
Okay then, Lizette, because again, we go back to having a look at what's available. And we've got that on page 25 and overleaf, on page 26. But the issue still remains is that those that are not covered in here have the opportunity of going to get into the annual plan process, or in this case, the emergency budget. So, am I correct in that? Yes, that's the option.
That's certainly possible.
Councillor Hills, and then I'll go to speaking.
Okay, but this is just a quick comment about...
Oh, I'll put you down. I got 4 people who want to comment, and so I'll put you down here as number 5. So just to comments, Councillor Casey.
I've got bad news and good news. I'll do the bad news first. The bad news is that in any other year we'd be looking at full discussion of options 1, 2 and 3. This is the reality of COVID-19. This is the reality of our emergency budget, that the status quo has to prevail. These aren't cuts, these are keeping services as they are. It's really pleasing, Liz and Cleo, to see the work that you've done, and I will highlight some of the points that you made in your report. We do have 145 facilities across Auckland. I didn't know that till today. Every local board has youth facilities except Great Barrier. 18 of the 21 local boards have youth as a priority. That is brilliant news for me. You need to work on those other 3 though. And the good news, so the bad news is, I'm sorry that we are stuck. But the good news is I Am Auckland was written by the Youth Advisory Panel. They drove that. It's a wonderful piece of work. It was due to come back in April. The Youth Advisory Panel was meant to be up and running by about May, June. The good news is that we've almost finished the selection process for all the demographic advisory panels, and the Youth Advisory Panel should be here in August to talk to the review of I Am Auckland, and that makes me feel really happy. So that's good news, folks. We have still got the demographic advisory panels coming to assist us.
Thank you. Councillor Walker.
Are we speaking now?
Yep, as I said, earlier.
So, before anything else, sure, I did put some amendments that I moved together with Councillor Watson. I understand that those amendments, I think, are being incorporated, so I will seek your guidance around that.
Just to confirm on that particular one, they haven't been incorporated as yet. Claudia as well as Koro are working on it, bearing in mind we only received it at 10:30 this morning, even though it was sent at 6:51. So,
Okay, in which case,
can I
in which
finish
case
first?
I'll move.
Can I finish first? So that work is being done, and that's what Koro was talking to Liz. I know that he's had a conversation with you, and it's trying to find a pathway forward. Koro, can you also, with Councillor Watson, who ended up looking at these recommendations, can you also have a discussion with him? So at the moment, Wayne, no, they haven't been incorporated, and that won't happen until I end up getting Claudia and Koro working on what you sent through at Maya got at 10:30 this morning.
Okay, in which case then I'll move those amendments, which you have, and I'd invite the seconder to second. And I'll then speak to them, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Not yet. You won't be speaking on them. If you wish to end up putting these amendments through, I've got no issue around putting them, but we need, as a committee, to end up having a look at them first. So that is going to happen. If you wish to end up putting what you've got up that you sent through at 10:30, we will put those up. I will then ask for comment from Claudia and Koro in regards to the work that they have been doing on those at 10:30. So if you wish to pursue what you have sent through at 10:30 that we received in the morning, no issue at all. But they're working on getting to a point where I and Councillor Casey can incorporate them into the recommendation, and that is the work that's been done. So I'm in your hands in regards to the amendment, Councillor Walker.
Well, it would appear that I'm largely in your hands, Mr. Chair. With your guidance, I would suggest that those amendments lie on the table until such time as you and Claudia and so on have resolved whether they can be incorporated or not.
And that's what I've exactly...
And so I will reserve my right to...
That's exactly what I've just indicated to you, and this is why I put it back to you in regards to what you wish to do around the original amendments that you have asked to be put up. I've got no issue in understanding yours to put those and those ones that you sent through with Councillor Watson. None at all, sure. But the work is being done. So if you want to reserve your right to speak up until this is being completed, that's why I'm asking you.
So to be clear, what I'm hearing from you, Mr. Chair, is that officers are working on incorporating those amendments. I'm more than happy with that, and I will reserve my right to speak when the officers have sorted that.
So it's been reserved, and like I said, councillors and Independent Māori Statutory Board, once we end up getting to a position that both Councillor Casey and I are happy, it could well be incorporated. But let's have a look when they've finished that. So I'm going to move to Councillor Dalton on Skype.
Oh, thank you, Chair. This is really about future state. You know, the ability to provide bricks and mortar from council is going to be constrained for many years now. And I think what I would like is for council to progress the conversations with schools and marae on how we can access their facilities after hours. And there's multi-benefits from using facilities on school grounds and on marae, because it gives that sense of belonging to our youth. That's a familiar place for them. We don't have an investment in capital, but we are there to be a partner and a stakeholder in the provision of the operational costs. And then we can fund organisations that we believe in, and Zeal is the example that Councillor Cooper used, but it's not That's not our decision, is it? And this is all local board stuff. These are local board relationships. They have them with their respective community groups. They have them with their youth, and they're the ones that will make the decisions of where that operational investment will lay. And, you know, TSI are doing some really good work, but it's not necessarily with the youth that we might be talking about here. It's not with the youth that I'm thinking about. My experience of trying to get a youth facility for Manurewa has been difficult, and that has been youth-led as well by the Youth Council, who got themselves a little space, and the local board funded it so they could evidence, this is council policy, they have to evidence that there is a need for a youth space. It is challenging, and we don't make it very easy at all, and it should be youth-led. They're the ones that have the diversity of needs, and this will be different in every space in Auckland, so a policy is not necessarily going to work here. It needs devolvement, and it needs devolvement to the lowest level. So it's an LTP discussion in my view. We're absolutely in status quo for the emergency budget, and if the decision of the council or local governing body is to continue to invest in supporting the provision of youth, then we increase the funding to local boards who hold those direct relationships, who know what they're doing. 18 boards have got it as a priority in their plans. It matters to them. They hold the relationships. They'll do a great job. And so we probably need to look away from bricks and mortar in this space and look to how we can build our relationships with the schools, marae, and any other facilities that might be available that exist already that are sitting there unutilised, because the operational cost is probably the only path we're going to have to go down for a very long time. Thank you, Chair.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Watson, you've seen what Koro has shown you.
Seen anything, so I'm just waiting to see what evolves there. So
because I'm doing the same in regards to getting a consensus from yourself and Councillor Walker as well as Councillor Casey.
If you can incorporate the substance of it, I'm happy to talk.
Yeah, but you've seen what?
No.
Oh, no. Okay. Koro, can you show them? They said they haven't seen it. Yeah.
What about a 5-minute break?
No, I'm going to go through, because during this I'm going to ask Councillor Hills, Matua Mook, to end up saying their comments. But do you wish to save that and have a look at the recommendations that could well be incorporated? That might be better. So can I get either Cloud or Koro to talk to the possible changes, as well as Councillor Watson and Councillor Walker? Well, really all of us.
So kia ora koutou, I'm happy to talk to these proposed amendments. So thank you for the suggestion to the amendments. We can understand it's obviously a very important subject to many people, particularly given this current environment where our youth might be particularly affected. For item number A, we received a proposed amendment to just be specific regarding adding the words the sites, and that the council-owned and or operated youth centres, they received council funding as we had listed on page 45, I believe it is. And I presume that amendment had been requested regarding an explicit nature and making that quite clear. So we're happy to endorse that. To point number B there, we've added the proposed amendment that some external youth providers may need to receive funding in order to ensure they are able to fill what would be otherwise gaps in youth provision. And certainly we acknowledge that as well, and we're happy to make that amendment. Point number 3 is regarding agreeing to option 1, that we would maintain the status quo, that the decision-making continues to be flexible, and what we propose to add is that the grant application opportunities continue to exist to meet the community needs. Those grant application opportunities by definition, allow us to consider gaps in service provision or social need.
So, Claudia, is that?
So if we're supportive with those changes, if that also helps address some of the concerns that were raised.
So, question to these, because at the moment they're just on the table in regards to both Councillor Casey and I incorporating them into the substantive, which has been moved and second. So, Councillor Walker.
Just in response to those changes, marvellous. So there was an additional suggestion that was put forward in the amendment, and that goes to option 1, which is around the status quo, and effectively suggested a very slightly modified status quo, and that would be decision-making continues to be flexible to meet community needs, but then the addition is with the development of interim guidelines for additional provision until a policy for youth centres is in place. So it's not asking for a policy, but it is acknowledging that there is no policy, but it's also suggesting that we start working on some interim guidelines because we actually don't have interim guidelines. And that would go to meeting some of the issues that a range of councillors have expressed, and there isn't any timing on those guidelines, but at least we're making some progress towards addressing some of the anomalies. So that's a suggestion through you, Mr. Chair, and so, that was in our amendment.
I understood that, and the reason why I declined including that in there is more policy work for the policy team to end up incorporating. I believe that it could be addressed in regards to E around Auckland implementation progress that is coming to August. For us to then ask our policy team, and we know what's happened as a result of COVID-19, we've had reductions across the whole council, and guess where some of the reductions are? It's in regards to our policy team, and I won't incorporate it, and that's where I stand in regards to this. I think it'd be captured into, again, recommendation E, Auckland implementation. So
through you, Mr. Chair,
that's my decision
here. Just to be crystal clear, this is not addressing policy. It is acknowledging that we don't have policy, and it's not even going there. So it's expressly recognising that, but it is indicating that it's desirable to have some guidelines, which are at this point inadequate. Sorry. So I'm just hopeful that the officers and yourself have got that, Mr. Chair. It's just talking about interim guidelines. It's not even expressing what those guidelines might be, but it is giving the officers some latitude to develop them. And that would be helpful, I would have thought.
So look, it's been taken on board, but I still think and believe that it's covered in E when they come back to the 20th of August, which is our next meeting. I again am adamant that in regards to any work that may end up getting done, I think the message has been heard, but that's where we sit now. So I'm really in regards to your hand, because we can end up going through now a full discussion around the amendment, but at the moment for me, that I think is covered in E, and that's where I am. So look, we can either deal with this now, and this is my suggestion. Please,
I was actually seeking a response from officers.
Please don't interrupt. Can you let me finish? What I'm saying is that this is the compromise that we've come through with the recommendation that was received by Mai at 10:30 this morning, and I'm just saying here, I will get you there. Yeah, sweet, but that's where and that's my comment and decision as the chair. So, Councillor Watson.
So, Mr. Chair, you've given that assurance it's going to be incorporated in as part of. I think it's been heard. It's been heard. Sorry, it'll be incorporated in. So, I'm happy to accept that then, just to expedite matters here.
Yeah. So Liz, I know you wish to have a comment, and then I'm going to still end up going through the list depending on how we settle with this. So, Liz, can I just get the... Yeah. Yeah, so I'll get the response just in case, and then we'll get that clarification.
Through the chair, the current status quo decision making allows the governing body and local boards to make decisions about investment in youth services and activities already, based on the outcomes in their local board plans, based on IM Auckland outcomes. So that ability to do that and make decisions based on agreed outcomes that have been set in local board plans and IM Auckland strategy already exist. And grant programs are aligned to those strategies and outcomes. So that facility already exists within the status quo option.
Okay, thank you, Liz.
Just to clarify
Councillor,
that.
Yep, thank you. Councillor Watson, you just heard what Liz said. Are you okay with that? Thank you. Just around the clarification, Councillor Cooper.
It was just, when you've got B, I feel like, for me, whether I can support it or not, is that it just feels like more ad hocery to me, and that worries me that that's just an option to now push for something else in this particular next budget, because we know we all have to make horrible sacrifices for all of our areas, and that's what worries me in supporting that. Yeah, and so it means then I can't vote for the whole thing if I'm,
Okay.
unless it was separate.
Yeah, Claudia, is there any comment in regards to B?
Maybe I'm correcting myself.
So first, just a clarifying question, if I may, councillor, are you referring to the amendment specifically or the entire?
In B,
Some external.
that read in B, adding that.
Yes, councillor, through the chair, I do think that is a valid point. I think it's very important at the moment to continue to follow a process that is quite fair and transparent. Perhaps the point was intended rather to acknowledge that some providers are reliant on different funding or additional funding to be able to provide the services.
Sorry, but it says may need, which gives an intention that then you can ask for it, rather than do receive, because some local boards will be funding some of those, and that's fine. It's absolutely their choice because they do have all those relationships. However, this then to me goes, oh, but it says that there. Now I'm going to do that. So that's this year we have to be so careful.
Happy to change the may need to do.
Yes, and that's very valid feedback. Thank you very much, councillor.
No.
So Councillor Cooper, we've just sort of made that little change in regards to providers do receive funding. So if that's okay with us, both Kathy and I have got no issue at all in incorporating into the substantive. So are we happy where we are? Because it's good to be happy. So if we are, I'm still going to go through to the speaking list because I haven't forgotten that. So, Councillor Watson, do you still wish to talk with this? Yeah, okay, so you'll start, and then we've got Councillor Hills, Matua Mook, Councillor Walker, if you wish to speak. We've also got Councillor Henderson, and then Councillor Cooper, if you wish to still speak, if not. Okay, so Councillor Henderson, you will close the debate, not unless Councillor Casey. No? Okay, so Councillor Henderson, you will close it after the list I've just called out. So Councillor Watson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And this is an important item. There's been a lot of talk about, post-COVID-19, but I would refer you back as far as our youth and our youth facilities go to the Auckland Plan 3-yearly progress report that we had just a couple of months ago. And in that report, in terms of our youth, and this is in some ways at odds with the kind of general tenor of the feedback in the report. We were told about this declining physical activity and related high levels of obesity, stress and poor mental health continue to persist in Auckland and remain a concern, particularly for young people. And Auckland in particular is signalled out in this. Auckland's young people have the lowest scores in the country for both weekly physical activity and time spent being active. Auckland children using active transport has seen a sustained downward trend. But the really worrying one for me, and it goes to the heart of this matter today, In 2018, almost a third of Aucklanders had a World Health Organisation wellbeing score of less than 13, which is indicative of poor emotional well-being and or poor mental health. Auckland compares poorly with other New Zealand cities. Suicide rates are also an indicator of mental health and well-being. The number of suicides in New Zealand reached its highest level ever, with the highest number of suicides being in Auckland. This was given by an increase in the numbers of, you guessed it, young people in the groups 15 to 19 years of age. They are the people our youth centres deal with, our designated youth centres. They're not at Scouts or Girl Guides. They're not whacking out links in the local gym. They're at the youth centres. They're the people who deal with those kids. It's not the schools. The schools kick them out. The schools can't deal with them. They try to. I know. I've been in secondary schools. The youth centres are the people who help deal with those kids in our community, wherever you are in Auckland. So I heard 18 local boards youths were a priority to them? Yeah, well, they're a priority to me, more so than any number of other things that this council does. So I listened to Councillor Newman there in terms of our most vulnerable and the process we're going through now. So I'm saying, as a councillor for Auckland, not just in my own patch, anywhere in Auckland, youth are a priority, and these vulnerable youth are top of that list of priority. So we have to tread a very careful path here in terms of public perception. We're having to do it with costs in the budget, but if we can't look after our young people and our vulnerable young people, then why would you bother with the rest of it? Because that's a mark of your priorities. A budget is a moral choice. A budget is a reflection of your priorities. If we look at the sums that are involved here, they're not big sums. Okay, in the scheme of things, they're not big sums. This process we've gone through today follows on from I Am Auckland, we've told. And if you look at I Am Auckland, like all our documents, it says all the right things about voice, belonging, health and well-being, and a fair go. So what we're asking here is a fair go across Auckland, not just for Hibiscus Coast, but for all of Auckland, a fair go for our young people. Now, if that doesn't come out of this, what has the last 2 years been about? This review was done as a consequence of the situation with the Hibiscus Coast Youth Centre, as it compared to the rest of the region. That's what prompted this review. 2 years on, I have no idea what this means for them. Sorry, I've read the report twice. I have no idea what it means to them. I've heard about pathways. I've heard about go and see this person, go and see that person. We've done that 2 years in a row. It's only to the grace of the Mayor that the situation was dealt with in those previous years. We're back again here today, 2 years in a report, and we're no further on. It's the same situation. I don't know what to do, what to say to these people. Just, oh yeah, put in a submission to the annual plan. That's a pathway forward for this massive big chunk of the northern part of our region. That's not satisfactory. That's not going to cut it. What does it take? Our region is going to stump up conceivably $60, $70 million worth of asset sales. All right? I've looked at the properties that are up. Can 0.5% of that go to a youth centre? Or it doesn't work that way, does it? Why not? We're in an emergency. We need to look at things in a different way. Why can't we make it a priority? 0.5% goes to our youth centre that serves our whole half. So I put that up as an idea, Mr. Mayor. Going to take 60 or 70 million assets, fair enough, if that needs to for the good ship Auckland, but don't make it all take and not even a little bit back. So this is either a priority in terms of I Am Auckland and Auckland Planned and everything else. There's one clear, glaring outlier here in this whole sequence of regional networks. If there are other ones, I back whoever those play Pilar, just the same. Absolutely the same. What I say for the Hibiscus Coast goes for any other youth centre in Auckland. But if we do not deal in a fair way, in a way that addresses these concerns pre-COVID-19, what are they going to be like post-COVID-19? That will be a reflection of us and our priorities. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Watson, and move to Councillor Hills. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Mike. Thank you, Chair. Just want to support the direction, but I do agree with Councillor Watson and others that we are going to have to look at how we prioritise more of our dropping funding for our youth at this time. I've always, I stood in 2010 for the Kaipatiki Local Board because there was no younger people presented on the board there, or previously there was no youth provision at all on the North Shore. My number one goal was to get a youth centre on in the area where I was living and on the board for, in Glenfield, Marlborough Park. That didn't happen by accident. That took 5.5 years of work. We had to do a feasibility study. We funded that through the local board. We had to do a full consultation. We did barbecues and work and consultation in every high school. We went to the intermediate schools. We held big days, online things. We got people in for the design work. We put a whole lot of renewal budgets together. We took budgets and grant budgets from all sorts of different areas to get that youth centre. It didn't happen by accident. It happened, we pushed and pushed and pushed. We converted one of our current halls that had a budget, and we used that ABS budget, and we used the renewals budget and other money to get that started. It wasn't just given to us, I guess. So I guess when people are sort of mentioning, some people have said to me, well, why do your area get this or whatever? That's what happened. It was so frustrating, to be honest, and I understand why Councillor Watson speaks. I felt like we would never get that youth centre up and going because it didn't seem we fit the bill. But eventually we got there. There was a lot of opposition to it because we were closing other people out of that hall to make it a youth focused space. So I guess that was a local board position. I'm happy to support this direction, and we do need to figure out how we get more funding for our young people. But I just want to say sure, that's how it happened. It was frustrating, but it was a really good win at the end of it, and that still gets outside funding. Also, the Devonport Takapuna Local Board have part funded the new youth centre that's going to be opening up there quite soon. I don't think that's receiving any council funding. It's being, I think, donations and fundraisers and things like that. But granted, parts of that community have been able to give a lot more money than maybe other parts of the community because there was been a lot of personal giving and things to that, and businesses giving into that youth centre as well. So I think the more youth centres we have across Auckland and areas of need is needed. And I don't, although there's a lot of work done here, I don't feel it really hits maybe where it needs to be, but that's only because we just don't have the money, or we have to figure out how we're going to get the money for every part of Auckland. And that will mean in a couple of weeks' time we make harder decisions around selling things, around what we reprioritise, whether we get a 3.5 or a 2.5 or whatever rates rise that is. Those are going to be the hard decisions that are all connected, and that will give back to our younger people. Speaking to a lot of younger people, trying to encourage them to submit on the emergency budget, a lot of them say, well, I don't pay rates, I don't, and in some respects they may be the least affected by the rate going up, potentially, but they could be the most affected by the cuts and the direct changes to our budget and delays of projects, and also the huge amount of debt we're going to have to put on our city, because they'll be paying that off in the future. So I guess this, on the back of our emergency budget, means we all should be encouraging younger people to submit and get involved, because when we're sitting around this table in a couple of weeks, we're going to have to make those decisions for them, even if some of them haven't submitted or been a part of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. Matua.
Kia ora, just quickly. I'm not sure that the status quo is done really well for Māori rangatahi or Pacific Islander for that account. As we heard earlier from around this table, that the current accessing of funding, and that is hard for our people. So the status quo, in our view, even though there's flexibility and the ability of local boards and councils to actually be flexible, it hasn't happened. There is a disparity there in all of the figures that have been spoken all about. I'd like you to send a copy of the report, if you can, to the IMSB, and so that we can actually look at the report a little bit more close and in depth, inclusive of some other members, and also the impact of with our rangatahi and the treaty responsibilities and the articles of the treaty with our rangatahi. So kia ora tātou. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ka pai matua. Move to Councillor Walker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd really like to thank you for allowing those changes. So that's really great. I'd just like to acknowledge the comments from Councillor Watson, my fellow ward councillor, with whom I entirely agree. For me, the critical concern around this report is around fairness, and in my questions, what is obvious is that the way some youth centres, and one in particular, is being treated is not fair. And that may be to the tune of maybe $100,000 that's not being shown here for each of all of the other facilities. So if you happen to be on council land, but if you're not council owned and operated as a youth centre, if you're a trust or the like, you fall through the cracks. And in the case of a particular youth centre, this has now existed for 23 years. And for the last 10 years now, I've been advocating for this and bringing it up consistently. And as Councillor Watson asks, well, what do you have to do? What does a local board have to do? What do youth have to do? Because frankly, we have a report, but it is still not adequately addressing that issue. And I can tell you as a councillor, and I know I speak for Councillor Watson, we're actively involved in youth. So we understand the youth suicide issues, the wonderful groups like Youth in Transition and other groups that we've got in our community that are desperately trying to raise money to assist at youth risk. And when I spoke with the people in those teams, and there are a number of them within our communities, they tell me that right now things are real bad. They've been hit financially, they've been hit in terms of their volunteer base. So if ever there is a time in respect of consideration of reports like this and going forward to an emergency budget to look after the most vulnerable in our community, then that time is now. And if you assess any organisation on success, it has often been stated that organisations and societies are assessed on how they care for their most vulnerable. And that is the young, and that is the old, and there are a number of other categories. And right now, they are the people that we need to be assisting, and we need to be directly acknowledging that through this process, which is why I asked for guidelines, because those guidelines aren't adequately here. And if I apply that across these council facilities, what is clear to me is that in a number of instances, and you can read it, there are facilities like Zeal that have crisis intervention, fantastic. Marlborough Park, youth health services, marvellous. Hibiscus Youth Centre, wrap-around youth services. And I won't tell you what that means, but it means pulling people back from the brink and literally saving lives. That's what it's about, and it's not just about youth, but it's around their families, their whānau, and they include Māori and Pacifica and other ethnicities. So I just hope that going forward from this, the questions that I've asked, the need for more information to fill in the gaps, and those gaps are outstanding, will be filled in quickly, so that in terms of the timing leading up to the emergency budget and then leading up to the long-term plan, because that is also critical, that we are able to meet gaps and big holes if we have worst case scenarios, and that would be tragic because those gaps will be measured in loss of life, loss of enjoyment of life, and many other things that are certainly important to me and I think important to all of us. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Henderson, and then there's two more that have indicated to speak, and that is Councillor Casey and His Worship the Mayor. So, Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, look, just briefly, I do support the direction, but this discussion has been really brilliant, actually, because it's brought into sharp contrast the sort of decisions we need to be making over the next few months, and indeed over the term. Firstly, I want to point out it's an honour to be the liaison councillor for the Youth Advisory Panel. Delighted by that, thank you, and yeah, very excited to work with the youth on that panel. We've got a great bunch of people there. I think we should all be very excited about the direction that it's going. Models where the community drive youth provision are really excellent, and in Waitakere I know these models very well, and we work very closely with a bunch of different providers that do that, that are not necessarily tied to the council or tied to council brick and mortar buildings specifically. And I want to acknowledge Ranui 135 in particular in my ward, who do an excellent job. They're not in a council community centre. They're barely reliant on physical buildings at all for their provision. But as Councillor Walker points out, they save lives. They do wonderful work in that community. Particularly in the Henderson Massey local board, I'm seeing through this excellent report, frankly. They have a lower than median income in that board, but I know that that's a blunt instrument, and there are areas of real poverty in that board. Unfortunately, those areas are also the youngest in that board. They're also the areas that have the highest need in terms of their mental health and well-being and all the stats around that. The highest areas of Māori and Pacifica concentration in that board. And so that's the sort of area of real need when we're talking about this stuff that we need to be targeting, and there are community providers on the ground that are doing excellent work, and I think it's our job, and particularly the local board's job as well, to be working with those groups, and they do that very well. I want to finish with my main point here. I just raised that this does bring into sharp contrast the sort of things we're talking about. And colleagues, we have hard decisions coming. I would invite my colleagues to think about this discussion that we've just had when you're deciding on your rating increases and whether you're supporting 3.5 or 2.5. When we discuss 2.5 or 3.5, we're discussing cuts to local board budgets that are either 10% or 20%. It is absolutely certain that this will affect grants to youth organisations that do vital work on the ground because they're usually funded through local board grants. The difference there will be directly felt by the youth in our city, and therefore I'd advise you to reflect on that as we go forward. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Councillor Casey, and then I'll go to Mulholland, who's asked, and then Your Worship, you can close the debate after and then I'll just thank our staff.
I'll just be very quick, and I'd just like to correct a feeling I had in the speeches by John and Wayne. First of all, I totally agree with you, and I'm sure everybody in this room totally agrees with you about the need. But there was an implication in what you were saying that somehow in voting for the status quo we are cutting funding to youth centres. We are not. We are just not investing as we should be because of the effects of COVID-19. And those speeches will be made again by all of us in the next few months as we go through the budget. I want to hear from the public of Auckland what their needs are. And if they agree with you, then that will have my support. But right now, we're in a public consultation phase. And I feel awful right now, just tell you that. And I'll probably feel awful every day between now until we finish the budget, to be honest, because it's not a budget I want. I want option 2. I want to fund these services. So do you, so does Wayne, so does everybody in this room. Guess what? It might not happen. But status quo is not a cut. And I'm pleased about that. Okay?
Thank you, Councillor Casey. Councillor Mulholland.
Well, thank you, Chair. I do appreciate the opportunity. I just wanted to comment to this. I do want to acknowledge the work that is done by the Whai Local Board, and I do say that on the basis that we established those when I was chair of the board last term. There is amazing work that is being done with our youth, and I also want to acknowledge the partners that the board had, and I think of Councillor Henderson and Councillor Cooper with regards to some of the groups, and we work collectively as boards, and I am one person who actually has worked for a youth suicide trust, and I can tell you the unfortunate stories I have in my memory of things I was told working in that environment are not memories someone wants to carry through their life, but I will. I support the good work that's being done, although I do think that we could always do better, and that is a fact of life. I agree, thank you, Councillor Casey, with regards to this is not the status that we want, but it is where we're at. So I just want to say that I do support the good work that is being done by our local boards in that regard, especially I want to acknowledge the work in the fight. And I did also sit in on Skype calls with our youth during COVID, and there is a youth board in the FO, and I am proud of the youth board. They are fabulous, outstanding young leaders in our community. So I sat in on their Skype meeting for the consultation with regards to the budget, and I am so proud of the young people for their views and opinions which are being shared through to council and then hopefully to other committees and our governing body, so that fair and reasonable decisions can be made. But I did want to acknowledge the work, the great organisations that we have, how we work collectively together in the past for our youth, and how sincere our youth are about a way forward. I sat there and I listened to the board on the Skype meeting, so thank you and kia ora to those fabulous youth in the FO area. Kia ora, thank you, Mr Chair.
Kia ora to that. And Councillor Newman, you've also indicated, and I still will leave His Worship the Mayor to finish off this debate. Yeah, I know.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I want to acknowledge the reflections as well as the work that has taken place, but I would reiterate, and I have to say to Councillor Casey, I'm not sure that the status quo is a maintenance. I actually think the status quo, in light of the changes that I'm sure are coming to ABS, will represent an erosion, and the concern will be what that looks like operationally and what will be the opportunity cost of that. It is not yet known, but I am almost as sure as night follows day, this will hurt. The status quo option will hurt. And the problem here is that the decision makers actually don't have a particularly good line of sight to the consequences of the decisions that have been taken. So I do look forward to getting, and I try to avoid the weeds, but I do look forward to learning more about the operational impact, because I feel that we need to know that. It is happening, it is current, and it will be difficult. And I'm not sure that there is an easy way to address that other than at least sticking to 3.5% rate increase. That's a bit of a signal as to where I might be thinking, because I am very concerned about vulnerable people in our community who will be affected by some painful changes to asset-based services and to the funding that the local boards are having to administer. I think that the wording around option one is very diplomatic, but I think the consequences of the changes that we face, which are being inflicted through operational savings, will be painful. So thank you, Chair, for leading us through this discussion, but I reflect that in particular, I reflect that comment to the Mayor. There are going to be consequences that we need to know about at an operational level that will inform regional decision making.
Yeah, before I hand it over, look, Liz and Cleo, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the work. We know where the genesis was in regards to getting this work done. Thank you for the work. The decision around operational decision around the cuts in the emergency budget that everybody's counted for, that is the decision that will be made around this table. But I just want to say to both you, thank you so much. And I'm going to, one, look forward to the 20th of August, and number two, allow His Worship the Mayor to finish this debate, and I will put the recommendation. But to you, thank you both.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I've sat here quietly just listening to the comments that have been made. Let me first say I support the recommendations as modified by Chair Filipina and Deputy Chair Casey. I think we're landing in the right place. I've listened to the professional advice of our officers. I was one that thought maybe stronger guidelines would help. I've listened to what they've said. I think that maybe flexibility is important and might not be helped by setting guidelines. What matters is what we actually do. I also agree, bricks and mortar, look, we could build centres all over the place. It's not necessarily the best investment of our money. It's the services we provide to our young people. Secondly, I want to acknowledge the passion and advocacy of Councillor Watson and Councillor Walker for the youth centre. I have visited the youth centre. I was pretty impressed with it. I think the anomaly in this paper is that we've got to make a decision about it one way or the other. Look, my attitude to it was positive, but the decision that we make ought not to be, and we won't make that decision here today, it's got to go through finance and performance. It can't be just ad hoc 100,000 this year, maybe next year or not. Is it effective? Is it making the contribution we want? If it is, let's try to regularise it. And I think that's the thrust of your comments, John. I listened to the passion about mental health and young people, and I think a lot of us share that, but we know that one decision like that isn't going to change the nature of it. What we come down to in the end is the context in which we make this decision. I want to pick up on Daniel Newman's comments to some degree there. Some of us listened to submissions from the Ratepayers Alliance the other day, and I kind of slightly fell off my chair when they started talking about vulnerability and equity. How the hell are we going to achieve an answer to helping the most vulnerable, for example, the rates postponement, 65 million? How are we going to achieve equity, which is part of our Auckland plan about inclusiveness, if we slash our ability to do anything for the people of Auckland? And that's why I opposed putting forward zero rates, and I adamantly oppose that. The majority feeling was we give the choice, and I hope people choose 3.5%, but I and everybody else in this room have to listen to what Aucklanders tell us around that. But for us in this room, yeah, look, we should support something like the Hibiscus Bay Youth Centre, but if we do that on that side, we've got to focus on where we draw the money in to fund not only that one centre, but a range of things that we can do positively for the people of Auckland. So we can't, and I was listening to what Councillor Watson said about, well, we're selling some assets. Yeah, look, we don't particularly like selling those surplus properties, but that is one way, if we do that, John, that we can actually say we've got a balanced financial budget that will enable us to support a centre like the youth centre, but still maintain the income. What we can't do is have a bit of it both ways. We can't go out there and say zero rates, don't sell anything, don't cut any capital programs, but by the way, this is still going to all work. We know, and the chair of the Finance Committee knows more than the rest of us, that we've got to find a way through. And I've been pretty happy with the way everybody's come around and said, look, yeah, we're in this together, we've got to make the hard decisions. But one of those decisions we will be making, and it'll also apply actually for our cleaners and pay equity, one of those decisions is, yep, we've got to look after the vulnerable. That includes those that have lost their jobs, those whose businesses have gone under on their rates, but it also means that we don't sacrifice the things that make our city a great place to live. So, look, I'm all in favour of this. I'm in favour of supporting the youth centre, but, any councillor that thinks that, well, we'll vote for this because it's a nice thing to do, but by the way, we won't give you the finances to do it, you can't sit on that fence. You can't say, we're not going to have the income, but we still want to spend the money. It's up to us to make the hard decisions, to do the right thing for our people, to make sure we spend the money well. I think this has been a good discussion, but I just wanted to bring the whole thing back around that context, we go for supporting something like the Hibiscus Coast Youth Centre in the context of this paper. Great. I'm really in favour of that. But please pull your weight on the other side of the thing by saying, here's how we're going to balance our budget, how we're going to bring the income in to make it possible to do these things. So thank you everybody for your contributions, particularly thanks to the local councillors for their passion for the centre.
Look, thank you, Your Worship. So I'm going to put the recommendation. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried.